If there is one section of Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit that has had a lasting influence over modern philosophy, it is the section on the master-slave dialectic, or the Lordship-Bondsman dialectic, that we find in sections 178 to 196. Apart from the preface, this is what most people will encounter and read over their course of studying philosophy. For Hegel, self-consciousness is in itself for itself. However, the consummation of self-consciousness, which arises through this dialectic, depends on the other. Hegel's ontology is necessarily dialectic, insofar that it depends on the other to be made manifest in oneself. Hegel takes this proposition from the book of Genesis, where Adam is lonely and not fully himself without Eve. Humans are made for each other as loving social creatures, but Adam does not fully know himself and is not content with his being without Eve. As Hegel says, self-consciousness exists in and for itself when and by the fact that it also exists for another. Hegel is not an idiotic libertarian like most libertarians are today. We do not exist just for ourselves. We exist for others. But in existing for others, we come to know ourselves better than if we were just alone. Self-consciousness, in being for oneself, but consummated through encounters with others, is Hegel's mean of avoiding that crisis of solipsism which plagues so much of modern philosophy, a problem that Hegel himself thought was prevalent in Fichte's philosophy of the ego. As such, Hegel defends the tradition of the social animus of humanity in asserting that self-consciousness, while existing for itself, equally exists for another. Thus, self-consciousness is not fully possible without the other, whom allows me to draw the dialectical contrast and opposition with, thus coming to understand myself better with a contrast, with something to pair myself with and against. This simple proposition of dialectical ontology is one of the most consequential ramifications of Hegel's philosophy, as we began with. We already know this dialectical ontology in other forms that we see in politics, that we use in our rhetorical vocabulary. Capitalist versus proletariat, left versus right, male versus female, so on and so forth. This is due to Hegel's ontological particularism. We are particular beings belonging to particular tribes, peoples, nations, indwellings, religions, biological distinctions, and so forth. The growth of self-consciousness therefore begins in double significance. The twofold significance, or double significance, is that in the encounter with the other, I begin to understand more about myself by observing the other, by encountering the other, by dealing with the other. In this encounter with the other, I know that I am not the center of the universe anymore. And this, again, is a rebuttal to the crisis of solipsism. But in this encounter with the other, I have become entranced by the other in discovering the other, the foreign, the exotic, the not I. And in doing so, in learning about the other, I can also now begin to reflect back and learn about myself. I can learn what I love in encountering something that I am not attracted to. I learn what is ugly by contrasting that with what I find to be beautiful, so on and so forth. However, in this encounter and discovery of the other, this inward turn to the self brings greater self-knowledge. And this is the paradox that many see in Hegel. It is only by encountering the other that I begin to more deeply to understand myself in these contrasts of encounters, in these encounters of contrast. In consuming and encountering the other, or coming to know the other, I can now use that knowledge of the other to begin knowing myself more deeply than I would have without coming to know the other. I am akin to the other in X, Y, and Z, while also being different from the other in A, B, and C. But Hegel asserts that we first come to know through difference before we reach similarity. As he says, at first it will exhibit the side of the inequality of the two, or the splitting up of the middle term into the extremes which, as extremes, are opposed to one another, one being only recognized, the other only recognizing. Thus my knowledge of myself rests in coming to know the other, for knowing the other is what allows me to then to better know myself through the contrast. If, for example, I was alone with nothing to draw a contrast with, I would be lost in universal and homogeneous selfhood. I would think that everything in the world is exactly the same as I, if I didn't understand difference, distinction, particularity. However, in difference, in recognizing difference, we come to grow in knowledge of our own particularity, as well as the particularity of the things I am encountering. Furthermore, as Hegel says, they recognize themselves as mutually recognizing the other. What Hegel means by this is that true self-knowledge, self-consciousness, which depends on the other, logically and definitionally means that when I gain self-understanding, I also recognize and come to know the other. They recognize themselves as mutually recognizing the other. I recognize the other as gaining knowledge. The other recognizes me in gaining knowledge. Since this depends on a dialectic of self-other or other-self, the discovery of myself is simultaneously the discovery of the other. And this is where the love of others truly flourishes. The discovery of myself, loving myself, also requires the discovery and loving of the other. Plurality and particularity exists within this unity or oneness. The oneness or unity that Hegel speaks of in this section of self-consciousness, of lordship and bondage, master and slave, is the oneness that comes in relationality, in the binding together in relationship. Two have become one in mutual recognition or knowledge of the other. This idea of unity in duplicity or multiplicity is something that Hegel draws upon from Greek philosophy and Christian theology. It is a spiritual unity, which is also an epistemological reality once you know the actual claims of how it's possible to come to knowledge of something else. For instance, you would have no knowledge of what a rock is, or what a dog is, or what a tree is, or what nature is, if you didn't actually have a relationship with any of that. You do not exist for yourself. You exist for the world. And in coming to know this reality, this relationship with the world, you finally understand yourself, the nature of yourself, and what you exist for. This struggle or striving for recognition is the essence of the dialectic of master and slave, of the self encountering the other and the other encountering myself. We do not hide from each other. We give each other in our encounters with one another. In this dialectic of encounter, we are both struggling to understand ourselves in relationship to the other, because not only are we relational creatures, we do not exist merely for ourselves, for just pure self-knowledge, as Hegel opened this section with, but that we also exist for another. Another is gaining knowledge of me by encountering me. I am gaining knowledge of the other by encountering the other. And in this mutual encounter, I am also beginning to more fully understand myself. I am Adam, or I am Eve. I am English, or I am Arab. I am Christian, or I am Muslim. I am German, or I am French. And we can only understand ourselves in this way if we do, in fact, encounter the other. It is important to remember or recognize, pardon the pun, that this encounter of self and other is not always peaceful, but emerges based on relationships of forced encounter. There is a struggle of absorption going on too. I am not X means that I am not X. I will never become X, as it is not my being, but I may begin to adopt the outlook of X in my dependent relationship with X. Hegel's ontology and self-conscious reality is equally and paradoxically one of essentialism, as it is also relational construction. For example, to be Catholic is to be Catholic and not to be Muslim. Conversely, to be male is to be male and not female, so on and so forth. Yet I am often tempted to become the other, and the other is tempted to absorb me in these encounters. And this is the famous master-slave dialectic, where we encounter each other in conflict, and I seek to absorb and destroy the other, rather than to come to know the other, and therefore more deeply understand myself. This, in fact, is what Hegel thinks most encounters have been like throughout history. Therefore, in the encounter of the other, there is a struggle of attaining self-consciousness while retaining a distinctive being and understanding of oneself as that distinctive being. This is the, quote, universal moment, the absolute melting away of everything stable, end quote, that allows oneself to understand oneself, self-consciousness, through relationship and experiences and knowledge of itself in contrast to others. It is in that moment when everything's stable, when everything about myself melts away in the encounter of difference, that I either recognize that difference and can reassemble myself in knowledge of what is brought by that encounter, or I will simply vanish and be absorbed into the great other that I have just encountered. And this is a very unsettling reality for us. The bondsman realizes the Lord is not the center of the universe, and as such, that the bondsman is not tied to being an extension of the Lord or the Lord's universe. This would be the ideal outcome of the master-slave lordship-bondsman encounter. Or the bondsman simply melts away into the other, into the Lord, into the master. But in doing this, all individuality is lost. And this leads us to what Hegel is actually trying to achieve in this section. Individuality. How do we actually attain particular individuality? Individuality comes in contrast with the other that I am not like. The stronger the differences, the distinctions, the greater the individuality. Thus, the stronger the differences and distinctions, the greater the self-consciousness and self-understanding. Through increasing difference and distinctions is recognized. The bondsman is not the Lord, and need not see and understand the world as the Lord does, but is himself, as a bondsman admittedly, and lives in a world entirely different than the Lord because of the distinct relationships and encountering relationships through being the bondsman. This allows the bondsman to be more fully the bondsman, or more abstractly, allows an individual to be more fully an individual in recognizing that it is not the other. And this reciprocates through the encounter with the other and the self and the other. As such, both parties grow in greater individuality and distinctiveness in recognizing the differences and distinctions between each other, and in recognizing the distinctions and differences between each other, become more fully themselves as individuals. This, of course, is the Hegelian ideal. This may not always happen in reality. One party may overwhelm the other, and the other becomes completely docile and subservient, as is often the case in the master-slave, Lords-Bondsman dialectic. This marks the elimination or the destruction of distinctiveness, which turns everything and everyone into a bland sameness, which prevents further self-understanding, the further development of self-consciousness. But Hegel is trying to tell us here that we must recognize the distinction and differences between us, and in doing so, accept the distinctions and differences between us, and to protect the distinctions and differences between us, which can only be protected by a relationship of mutual distinction, of mutual difference. Returning now to why this is so important, and why this is not, as imbecilic readers of Hegel often assert, a contradiction, just think about it in your own life. You know more about yourself when you are contrasting yourself with another. And we do this even at the species level. We know ourselves as humans by coming into relationship with those things that are not human. I know that I am not a rock by encountering a rock and comparing the rock to myself. I know that I am not a dog by encountering a dog and comparing the dog to myself. And all throughout our existence, In encountering the other, we have the moment to learn about the other, to recognize the other as other. And in doing so, I can more deeply learn about myself and to begin to form that distinctive individuality that is uniquely mine and only mine, that no one else can take away from me. And this is what Hegel's master-slave dialectic is actually trying to teach and communicate. It is in relationship and encounter with another that I more fully become an individual.